Good morning, Grid Connections listeners, and welcome to 2024. I'm really excited to kick off this year's first episode with Matt Teske. He's the founder of Chargeway. And coincidentally, for long-term listeners, you may know Matt was actually in the first episode of Grid Connections we recorded. So it's really an honor to have him on again, and especially to talk with him about the new version of Chargeway. They're officially calling it 2.0 of the app, but we go through some of the new functionality and how it makes it a lot easier for even existing users of EVs that want a road trip or just kind of learn more about charging around them to really explore and use a lot more functionality. In addition, I think this is a great episode for anyone who might be new to charging or road tripping EVs and have been kind of curious what other options are out there to really try and make it as hassle-free as possible. And Chargeway has always been a great example of what they're doing to really try and streamline the process. And it's a really fascinating company because they're making really big inroads, but they're also a very small and agile team. We talked to him about the new version, along with some of the current other things that Chargeway does around even offering in dealership beacons and other educational material that even current users might not be aware of. And if you're in the auto OEM industry, I definitely recommend reaching out to Chargeway to look at these other ways to maybe educate your current staff. I think after we really talk about the new and kind of fascinating parts of Chargeway, we also got to talk just about the larger EV charging ecosystem right now and some of the pros and cons of what we're seeing. For those of you who are interested in either trying out, learning more, or even downloading the Chargeway app, you can find all that information in today's show notes. So, with that, I just want to say welcome again to 2024, and please enjoy this episode with Matt Teske of Chargeway. Enjoy.
Thank you for having me, Chase. Good to see you again.
Yeah, just in case people aren't familiar with you or Chargeway or haven't heard the previous episodes, can you just give a real quick overview of what your team is doing and how you're making a huge impact in the EV space today?
Definitely, yeah. Chargeway, for those who aren't familiar with what we do, Chargeway is a software platform and mobile app, and we simplify EV charging and how to understand how EV charging works. And we focus on that by allowing you to choose your EV inside of our mobile app, for example, and then we do all the thinking for you. And then our UI is unique, our user interface, in that it uses colors for plug types and simple numbers for power levels. So that when you look at the map, you know that you can go to green stations because your vehicle has a green plug, and then you will know the maximum charge level of your vehicle is, let's say, a level 6, and then you'll see 5s and 6s and 7s on the map. You can use all those. You can use the 7, but you'd max out at 6 because of your car. It's a way to just super simplify how to understand how charging works by sake of can you connect, and then how long will your charge take. So we initially introduced the idea about 6 years ago now. It was originally when I walked around with a laptop at a conference and said, here's an idea. And it turned into a software platform and mobile app. And just recently, we launched version 2.0 of our software for the mobile app, and huge response. It's been great because it's not only a station finder, it's also a trip planner, and it's got a lot of other features that I'm sure we can dive into. But our goal and mission is to just take all that engineering that is difficult to navigate with EV charging
Exactly.
and do a lot of thinking for folks. That's really what we want to accomplish. So.
Yeah, and I think what's so great about your approach in the platform is I think a lot of people listening, they're going to know the difference between a kilowatt hour, the difference between a LFP and a NMC battery chemistry, all these different things that I know our listeners kind of nerd out and really enjoying what we like. But at the end of the day, it's as much as we like to think that the world revolves around us, we're a small group of the small section that is the automotive industry, and for most people it's just one part of that they don't even think about of their daily lives. And that's
Yep.
what I love about what you're doing and what you're so passionate about, is to really simplify this. I've kind of even jokingly said, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I've kind of jokingly said it's like it's the grandma EV app. Like you just,
Sure.
it's so simple where you can give it to, it makes, there's a lot of people that love EVs because of all the technology, but I do know quite a few people that kind of like the simple traditional car because right or wrong, through maybe bad marketing or just lack of exposure from other companies, it's kind of made EVs seem like, okay, I'm buying a new appliance or I've got to know all
Oh
these
yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And what your software does on the app, and I believe now with some of the integrations to even kind of show up in the car infotainment, it really does bring it down to be like it removes all the hassle and really does all the hard work for you. Because I think one of the other things too is I love taking road trips in my EV, and I'm kind of a big enough nerd to actually enjoy, like, okay, if I do this, I'll be slightly more efficient if I avoid this mountain pass. And there is kind of, I've talked to a few other people in the automotive industry. Actually, John McElroy from Autoline out of Detroit even said this. He's like, one of the things that I find intriguing about EVs is it's kind of like the Western frontier. It's like you're actually having to figure out all this stuff now that we've kind of taken for granted for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
And he's right, but it shouldn't be that way for everyone if you want to see people actually be able to have an EV as their only car. So
Yeah.
I think it's really exciting to have you on. And a big part of the kind of the reason you're on today is with the second version launch of Chargeway that recently happened. So I think it would be great just to kind of, as you've already kind of said, the history, just kind of announce some of these big changes and what's really kicked off 2.0 of Chargeway, Matt.
Yeah, well, the focus out of building the new version of the app and the software was really, it was born out of learning and talking to drivers as well as utilities, auto dealers, other stakeholders about what do they need and how do we have a collective conversation that can be an easy conversation for everybody. And so what we wanted to focus on with version 2.0 of the app was how do we take features that people enjoy about what we did in the first version of the app, but make it even all the more so integrated and automated. And as an example, we often talk about, how can we educate people on power, and we see tactics all the time of let's call this hyper, let's call this ultra, let's call this
Yeah.
super, let's call this rapid, let's whatever, and it doesn't help anybody understand it. It's marketing, right? And so we have our level system, levels 1 through 7. It clearly denotes that there's differences, and you can see that visually on the map. But we took it a step further. In the original app, we had a charge time estimator. You could choose a power level, set your battery level, and get an estimated charge time based on the power level and based on what your car could do. This was a separate feature before from the station map. We basically just integrated that feature into the station map itself. So now we have a dedicated vehicle detail screen where you can adjust your battery range, and then everything that happens on the map is then dynamic to your vehicle's settings. So you can then click on power levels all throughout the map, and it will give you an estimated charge time based on your vehicle's capabilities, the station's capabilities, taking into account charging curve, all those little things that we know are happening in the background. But we serve up what people want to know, which is if I'm driving this car and I pull up at that station with X% left, how long do I got to wait? I mean, that's what average people want to know. And so we're focused on having a different conversation than most people in the industry.
Yeah, I think, I mean, even before we start recording, you kind of mentioned the experience you recently had at an auto show where these people were looking at one brand of car because that's what they knew. And they're like, okay, this will take so long. It'll be two charges. And then you kind of had to be realistic when it's like, well, have you looked at this other brand where it essentially makes it one stop and it's a much
Yeah.
shorter stop?
Yeah.
And I think that's what really helps. I mean, I'll even say it, I'm a pretty big visual learner. And
Mm.
I think your UI has done a really good job of solving a lot of the issues. I think there's other apps out there. Obviously, there's the plug shares of the world that'll rate the charger.
Mhm.
But your technology kind of goes a little bit beyond that, where it even has the route planning functionality.
Yep.
But I think as anyone who's listening to this has probably unfortunately seen or experienced, you pull up, let's say at Electrify America, I can't remember if it's the Hyper, the Fast, the Light Speed Charger, whatever the 350
Right.
kilowatt one is, and there's a Chevy Bolt there.
Yeah.
And no offense to Chevy Bolt drivers, but those things top out like 60 kilowatts, and I have seen it
Ooh, you're
myself.
being
And so,
you're being generous.
yeah. And there are, I know, plenty of horror stories where someone comes like, no, plug here because it charges faster, and it's like, well,
Oh yeah.
unfortunately,
Well,
that's not exactly
they
true.
they hear language like hyper or something, and
Yep.
they hear that's the faster one. So if they don't know what they don't know, they just grab it thinking it'll be faster, not having any clue. And so one of the things we actually built into the new trip planner for Chargeway, the updated version of it, is depending on the vehicle you're driving, once we route you to stations and suggest your stops, if there are multiple power levels at that location, we will suggest the optimized power level for your vehicle to optimize throughput at that station, because that way it's not about having a discussion about hyper versus 150 or
Right.
350 kilowatt or what have you. Just go, look, if there was a gigantic green 7 and a gigantic green 6 on these chargers, and this thing is telling me go to the 6 because my car is only capable of charging up to level 4, it helps quickly educate on, oh, it doesn't matter if I use 6 or 7, it's the same fill up speed. It gets away from the fluffy marketing of just saying something to say something to make it sound great, and actually educates people. And that's the one thing we really focused on with the version 2 app was to say, how do we make this truly customized to each user, but also make it really smart? And I will say, I mean, Chargeway now, in my opinion, is the most intuitive and intelligent app you can use for EV charging because we are doing so much of the math behind the scenes for you to make it simple. And I think that was one of the best compliments we received from someone is they said, just looking at it seems so easy and so simple, but because I know how much complicated technology and engineering is and math is going on, that means you were able to make it this simple because you understand the engineering. And I said, yeah, that's a very good compliment. I appreciate that. So, I mean, and this was coming from someone who's an early adopter who said, you know, I'm skeptical of everything that doesn't give me all the data right up front.
Right.
But you guys are managing it really well. So I think we'll have more and more of those moments now that we have, as far as I'm concerned, was just a more elegant, modern interface in the product, and it's just really well polished. And so far the feedback has been phenomenal. So
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I mean, I've even seen some of the feedback just randomly on Twitter and other places where people have been kind of leaving those responses that they've been happy with this new software update. But I think while saying it's 2.0 is a big step, and there's obviously a lot going on in the back end, it's been fascinating just to me as someone who's kind of followed Chartway for so long to see all of the additions that your company has added.
mhm.
Because obviously it started as an app, and then it was like, okay, and when it started as an app, there were far fewer cars. So it's like, okay, you've got the Tesla UI, and then there's like two other cars that you have to figure this out for. So this helps those two other cars.
Yeah,
But obviously, that's drastically changed.
yeah,
And even as a Tesla driver, it's kind of fun to use and play around with it to just look at other options when you're, believe it or not, in areas where there aren't as many superchargers.
yeah.
Having said that, now we look at where Chargeway started, where it's going. I think it'd be really interesting to talk with you about the beacons and all these other kind of things
Oh
that
yeah,
you guys are now doing that are actually more or less using that software you built for the app, but a whole the other side
yeah.
of kind of the education and getting the awareness of how to make charging much easier for people.
Well, yeah, the big thing that we were focused on with again the beacon, the Chargeway beacon as we call it, is a retail kiosk that uses the exact same software as the mobile app. And the intent was to say, let's design a way to explain and visualize what is a very chaotic landscape for understanding how to navigate charging, but make it consistent through every touch point someone is going to have through their customer journey, whether that's researching online and they're at a website, we can put it in a website. If they go to a showroom for a car that they were interested in buying, they have it in the showroom, and then they find out they can download it to their pocket. The repetition of simple consistency with simple consistency is very important in retail marketing and retail products, and that's what we've sought to create and in an agnostic and holistic fashion. So people sometimes ask, like, what's the one liner of charge? I'm like, well, it's the branding of electricity as a fuel. That's what it is. It's a packaged way to visualize all the options you need to know how to navigate, and then it's tailored because it's software to the automaker that you want to look at, to the dealership and the brands that they sell, and inevitably to the car that you buy. Again, it is designed with a lot of intelligence behind the scenes. And the beacon, as an example, was just one way to address a big problem, which is dealers they don't ever have to explain fuel when they're selling a gas car. They just say, go buy it and then go to the gas station. You're fine. And that's how most people shop. So, to your point about that example, that one couple we talked to, they had a brand of vehicle they've always bought. And so, when they think we need to buy a new car, this brand we've always owned has an electric version now. Well, that's, of course, the one we're going to buy because we trust that brand. They're not thinking, even as a consumer, I have to shop thinking about energy efficiency of the battery pack based on the range. What is the charging capability? And some of this stuff will even out over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. And to quote Gabe Klein from the Joint Office for DOT and DOE, he's on a podcast that they did internally. He said adapters are going to be a part of EV ownership for the foreseeable future. And so this element of you have to know you can connect to fill up, and then once you've connected, how long do you have to wait? These are fundamental questions that average people need answered quickly. Whereas early adopters, they'll dig all the way down in the weeds and
Right.
find the answers like you or me might. But yeah, at face value, if we want to grow the EV market and make people feel happy and comfortable, we have to think different about how we communicate. And the beacon at the dealers is just one way to help solve that problem in the journey someone will be on.
I think that summarizes it beautifully. And you're totally right around making it easier for people because this really actually isn't a new thing for automotive. There's always been kind of like obviously the automotive nerds who want to look into the specs like, oh yeah, if I get the turbocharger for this, or if I get the inline six versus the V4, there's clear things that 90% of people do not care about.
Right.
But there's
Yeah. The
always been
motor
that
trend
option.
readers that are like,
Yeah,
oh my gosh, the
exactly.
displacement on this thing is crazy. Yeah.
It's over 10 years, it's gone up by 0.1 liters. Wow, there's
Right.
3 more horsepower. Yeah, exactly. I
Right.
mean, color it however you want. It's still being a nerd in a specific
Sure.
knowledge base.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely true with EVs. And I think it's great to see that how that's grown because
Hmm.
we've had a couple of the people on the podcast so far, and I've talked to them where now you have the hot rodding community that's doing the same
Yeah.
thing. And they're looking at permanent magnet motors versus different types of motors with this chemistry. And they're kind of approaching it from that, but it's on the complete opposite side of the guy who's trying to get down from 260 watt hours per mile to 250 just to get that like extra efficiency out of it. But once
Right.
again, very cool stuff across the board, but those are outliers.
Well,
And
yeah, it speaks to the issue that we've been talking about now for over a half a decade, which is we have to ask ourselves, where are people coming from? And anytime you're taking any product to market, this is just marketing 101, is if there's an incumbent product that the general public loves using and you're trying to supplant that, okay, what is it about that product that they love? And the argument that many people use about, oh, if you buy an EV, you don't have to go to that stinky gas station anymore. My response is most people couldn't care less. I mean, if they are buying gas, the biggest concern they always have is the price. But the idea that a gas station is so stinky that they would never want to go there ever again, there are certainly people that will say that. But is it the vast majority of the populace? No, because if that were true, gas cars wouldn't be very successful. But people are willing to deal with that to say, I'll go fill up and it takes me 5 to 10 minutes and it costs me $50 or 60, 80, who knows, $100. But they're willing to pay for that convenience of the other product that they need, which is their mode of transportation. So
right.
gas is just a built-in necessity that they think they have to have. How many times have we heard when people say, "Oh, it's a pure electric car," and they say, "Yeah, but where's the gas go?" And because they equate
I
cars to
even heard that a month ago
gasoline.
about a Tesla, and they're like,
Yeah,
wait, why, what makes them special? They're just hybrids. And I was like, I thought they were
not ex-
joking, but I mean,
yeah, no.
it's exactly true. It's still a thing.
It's one of those things that I think that we've been beating this drum now for literally years, but it's becoming more obvious now because as we've been discussing and as we chatted about before we started, is we're hitting that mainstream market, and these people that we want to have buying into and believing EVs for their driving needs, they need to be explained the information far differently than what we've been doing. We can't just keep going back to the well saying, well, everybody will think like an early adopter. And the answer is, if that were true, Apple computers wouldn't exist. I mean, so
Right.
we really need to be thoughtful around how we present technology to people. And again, back to the incumbent aspect of what is the product people have been using forever? It's a magic liquid that, yeah, it smells and it's expensive. But boy, when you get that magic liquid and you put it inside your car, you get to move freely and quickly. And it doesn't really take much out of your life for time. And so that's important. And knowing how, if that's the competitive landscape of how you need to communicate how your fuel works, you better be bringing more to the table than, well, this is a J1772
Yeah.
7.2 AC kilowatt connector that can charge you up in about 8 hours time. And then your only way to make that sound better is saying something ridiculous like, I tell people it takes me 10 seconds to charge. And every time I hear that, I say, please never say that again. Because I could say the same thing about pumping gas because all you're
Right.
talking about is connecting to your fuel source. And I get you're being creative and kind of cute around, well, then I just go in my house and I go on with my life. Perfectly fine, but that's not what an average person that knows nothing needs to hear. They will actually want to know, how long does it take to fill up? And then when you break the news of, well, that's at my house and it takes, if I need a full
Yeah.
charge, about 8 hours, it immediately sounds terrible. And then you're trying to regain their trust again by saying, oh, no, 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 but then if you find a DC fast charger, it only takes maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And they go, great. But then when they realize that that's at the right fast charger with the
Right.
right car, I mean, you see this game is we have to be much more thoughtful about how we communicate this, because people are going to just start calling BS, frankly, on the EV industry. And I, for one, can't blame them. And that's what we've been working very hard to try to resolve. So,
Totally. And I think it is just kind of a confusing juggling of, as you even said, the J1772 versus the North American Charging Stand, CCS1, CCS2. it all seems to be kind of going more towards a single, or depending on the market, a unit. But even then, that's still years away from, and we're not even sure if that's going to happen.
Yeah.
It looks like it will, but as we've
People said
seen
that about
before,
CCS a year ago.
they
So,
said that about Chatamo too. That's like that's the future.
but let's be fair. Tesla's plug type, which is now the NACS, NACS, J3400. If you're talking SAE,
Yeah,
it is without doubt the best design. It is elegant, it's simple, it's lightweight, it's identical to what you'd use at home and away from home. So the user experience of that is very elegant, and that's credit to them. And it only took automakers that aren't named Tesla years to realize, oh yeah, the fueling experience is a fundamental part of this ownership of an EV. And so, credit to Jim Farley when he said, you know what, hey, we're making a pivot, and then everybody else that kind of came on after the fact, it's like, well, I mean, not everybody's here yet. I mean, still some
right,
outliers, like Volkswagen Group is still kind of saying no. And fairness, they've got billions invested into a charging network that
right,
doesn't have NACS on it. But these are things that, even to your point, even if we waved a magic wand tomorrow, and if everything became, the Tesla connector, the NACS connector, or the red connector in Chargeway overnight, we'd still have to contend with power. We
right.
still have that gamemanship of that conversation we just had about it takes me 10 seconds. Oopsie, I meant 8 hours and kind of thing. So it's not like it's the silver bullet solution, but it certainly is a good step forward, in my opinion, for making people enjoy the experience more, for sure. So,
Well, and it goes back to exactly what we were saying earlier about these other, the two brands that these other people were looking at,
mhm.
because at that, there's that, in that comparison, they're talking about the same charge port, but the battery side of it completely changes what that dynamic is, and
Oh,
the
yeah.
charging ability for how often and how long they have to stop to charge there.
Yep.
With with the work you've kind of done there, with some of the integrations you've done with the, because I'd be kind of curious to hear your experience while Chargeway has kind of evolved with, because I believe it's compatible with CarPlay and Android Auto, or just CarPlay, or
Currently CarPlay and Android
gotcha.
Auto. We've been focused on trying to get that out to market. Version 2 and the redesign basically got bumped up the list on getting that done.
Fair.
But yeah, Android Auto, for the emulation for Android Auto, is something that we're hoping to have out at the beginning of the year. So,
Well, in your experience of kind of going from the app to now the actual infotainment in the car, were there any surprises or kind of any interesting things that you learned with that addition, or was it kind of more or less now the all that's changed is the view for the
uh,
driver?
oh, and actually no, it's the former. I mean, the problem with that's not a problem, but Android Auto and CarPlay, by design, they are trying to make it as easy to simplify, to the UI UX of it, make it so there's not a lot of distraction on there. They reduce a lot of content off of what you can show, so you have to be very selective with what you show. But it can start to really chip away at the value of what the software is doing in some ways. And there's also just some limitations around what the software can do in iOS and Android when you're emulating inside the car. Certain treatments they do to mapping, for example.
Mm,
We have our own UI for how we identify pins and charges on the map with color and number for plug type and power. But how Android and how iOS might collectively group pins together throws off our UI a bit, and there's really no workaround for it. But it's their way of trying to, again, take what you're offering up as an app, feed it into the vehicle world in a way that it creates value but also doesn't distract.
right.
So I mean, there's a lot of people that get a lot of joy out of using CarPlay, and we've had a lot of our users tell us that they're really happy that we have it. But there's ways we'd love to refine it more. But there's just some limitations to it currently. Frankly, I think that once Apple really steps into the game and starts offering software for vehicles, I mean, Project Titan aside, and if they're building
Yeah,
some
yeah.
EV or whatever, like that's me, but if they're gonna come through with what they're talking about for in-vehicle infotainment and software, frankly, I'm excited to see what that could be. Because if you are talking about driving EV right now, I mean, Teslas, they are the number one when it comes to software, UI, UX, and how smooth it operates. It's just very well built. And frankly, everyone else is behind that, still just trying to figure it out. And that's even for vehicles that have Google integration. There are some areas there where there's just still some needs for improvement. So I think that's a fundamental piece. So CarPlay and Android Auto are good as a kind of a stopgap, I think. But
Hmm.
we'll see what happens as those two tech titans really start to really get into this space. Time will tell, and hopefully we get to work with them on it. So
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, I know it's kind of one of those easy things that I think it's probably true for a lot of listeners too, where it's like if you're renting a car and you don't know or you're not familiar with that brand, having the CarPlay kind of is just like the easy
sure.
thing to plug it in and just now you know what how the car works
Well,
or
it
how.
feels familiar, right? You're just kind
Right,
of like,
exactly. And
okay, this is not scary.
right, right, right. And I think that fundamentally it kind of goes back to a core value, maybe unintentionally, of the Chargeway app, of just trying to make it something familiar, something easy, and really to simplify it
Yeah.
across car brand. Because I've used it when I've kind of played with a couple other different car brands, and I don't really either trust the uh, native routing software, or to be honest, sometimes it's just so slow that I just say whatever
Yep.
and go with something I kind of know and trust more. With that, has there been many conversations, or can you share if Chargeway has really been working with any OEMs to like natively help their actual infotainment routing systems?
Yeah, we've had plenty of those conversations with plenty of OEMs, and we're having more of them again because I think again rewinding 4 or 5 years when we first came to market with our solution, we met with everybody, and
Yeah.
that include I mean that name an OEM, we met with them, and I think what we discovered quickly then was we were having meetings with people that had never even thought of this. They were
Mm,
running EV teams at legacy OEMs and getting their feet under them for what they needed to build, but again the perspective of the automakers is this isn't something that we normally solve. We build the car. These will have big batteries in them. They'll have a connector on it. Yes, we need some software, but we can source that. We can find a software partner that can do that for us, etc. And I think it was an interview done by I think it was Jim Farley when he was on a podcast, sometime this past year, and he commented on that because he said, look, he's like we currently have I forget how many software vendors that he mentioned,
right.
but he said we have to get all of them to line up on the same page now. And that's not simple. Like there's a lot that goes into making that happen in the ways that we need to be thinking about how an EV operates. And I've appreciated watching the candor from people like him around the challenges that the legacy OEMs face as it relates to product development and then manufacturing. And that's something that again, 5 years ago when we met with a lot of folks saying, "Hey, here's what we've developed, and this is why we think you should be paying attention." Many of them said, "Yeah, we agree, but this is going to get solved elsewhere." And here we are half a decade or more later, and it didn't get solved elsewhere. In fact, we still have issues related to Volkswagen Group having, gone through a
Right.
lot of turmoil with software. Even Ford's team has said, yeah, we're going to do stuff internally, but we're inviting other platforms to be a part of what we're doing. But then you have other companies like GM, they are all in on using Google. And that's going to be, and they've said, like, we're going to do our own stuff in house too. You're not going to have CarPlay anymore. You're not going to have Android Auto. And the response to our conversation we just had, how many people read that news and on social media were basically saying, "Are you crazy? Like
Right.
this has to be so perfect, And it's a
Yeah, no,
big
and we
thing."
it's definitely that alone has been a topic we've talked about on this episode, that decision, and it just needs to be pretty damn good. I've seen a couple early reviews saying it is pretty good, but I mean that, like we just talked about, it's a big crutch for people when they're getting into a new car, and it's just one of those battles, and of all the things that you have to essentially rebuild and think about and put the investment and resources in when going to a fully electric platform, that kind of makes the question is like, is that the biggest priority right now?
Oh yeah, and how often do we still see people on owners groups that'll put up an email they got from the brand of vehicle they own. It'll say like you're due for an oil change, or it'll even
Right.
say it inside the car,
Yeah.
and they're just kind of like, really, and it's just I think in fairness, we're asking a very large global industry to think differently about the product they've built for the last century, and it's a lot to unpack. Aside from the skin and bones of the cars that they built, and that's where again the legacy auto brands they still shine. You could put
Right.
a brand new Audi or Ford or anything next to some of the newcomers, and you can see that, well, these legacy brands, boy, they know how to put together a car outside and inside, and it fit and finish is great. Materials
Yeah.
oftentimes are so spot on, but that's just skin deep. If you go underneath, battery, software, access to electricity.
Livability is what I kind of always refer to it as, is
Yeah.
like yeah, there's just I mean, it's as funny as it is, like even my wife doesn't one of her things or we have two cars of all things. One is a Tesla Model Y, which is kind of our road tripper daily car. And then the other car is a 1987 Land Rover Defender 90, which is about as complete opposite
Yeah, I was gonna say
as you can
those
get.
are woohoo.
The plan is to make that electric eventually, but it's
Uh,
living in Central Oregon. It's a great adventure vehicle, and I love the thing for completely different reasons.
mhm.
But the problem is, like a car like that has infinitely more character than I don't care what brand you want to throw at it of its modern equivalent, because they've all more or less gone to electric steering, all these other things that kind of, and it's Land Rover. That's kind of the beauty of it is you're happy if it starts, and even happier if there's not
All
like a
the
mouse or something in the car or any other kind
right.
of pleasant that, but I mean that's it gives a character.
All the old
Uh
cliches around like, yeah, you love it if it runs kind of thing, you
right.
know?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
no. And that's also the ironic beauty of it. Like I opened it the other day just to look underneath and check a couple of things, and I can't think of anything I have seen recently, not even car wise, just like so many like products or appliances that have so few wires. There is like essentially it goes from the battery to the lights and then a couple of check engine lights, and then the rest is all hardware and manual, which
Wow.
is kind of beautiful kind of simplicity to it. But that's going down a whole different rabbit hole.
There's
But
something said about
it's
analog. I mean, there's it's it's
totally,
okay. Yeah.
and that's like a car that really has not many features. It doesn't even have a tachometer or even it has a CB radio that's own installed,
That's
but it
awesome.
doesn't have a regular radio. um, and then you look at, yeah, you're right. Like some of the Audi, I mean, pretty much any of the German brands, amazing on the outside, great styling. Get in the seats, feel amazing. My mother actually is looking to replace her decade-old Mercedes, and she's kind of been going back and forth because the one thing she wants is it to be electric.
Mhm.
But even then, it's like she starts playing with these other things, and she gets kind of either overwhelmed, or you're right, it's like the livability of it
Yeah.
just kind of falls apart. And I think this kind of goes. What I was trying to say was my wife. One of her big things now is because of the Tesla. Like if she buys another car, like the dog mode feature is she won't consider a car because we have dogs because it has that kind of silly thing.
Mhm.
But any modern electric EV should really be able to do it.
Oh,
And it's that
like this is
livability thing that you the companies that if you want just a car to get you from point A to point B, and that's what a lot of people say they want, that's sure, that's pretty easy. But when you
yeah.
start kind of like talking to people about how they use the car or what's really important to them, that's when you start, there's that kind of idea of like, oh, just because this car company can build something that has better panel gaps or something else like that, it
Mhm.
really falls apart. And why some of these startups have kind of transcended from being startups and are now very large, successful new automotive companies.
Well, and we're kind of just walking around the topic, but I mean, we're referencing Tesla in most ways, and I think that
Right.
and Rivian as an example, there's a lot of people that came out of the Tesla alumni group that joined companies like Rivian that have taken a lot of learnings out of some of the cutting their teeth
Good
at
artist
Tesla.
copy, great artist steal kind of thing, which
Yeah,
is
right.
fine. And it works
Yeah.
for them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even the little stuff like you got dog mode inside the Tesla, and you got like the little Sasquatch dude inside of Rivian.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but those little things that add a level of comfort and some just like cuteness is not everybody wants to. We've seen movies about the future where it's like these heads
Right.
up displays and screens that have just charts and numbers and lines and graphs, and for some reason everybody on the ship knows how to use it. And I'm looking at
Exactly.
that going, I got to be honest, I don't think that's like
That
how
seems like a step
people.
back.
Well, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, I think most people are gonna be like, do you guys have a button that says
Right,
easy on it? Because back in like forever ago, there's a company called Staples that did that, and I loved it. I mean, and it's
right.
a gag, but that's how people think. And I think that the in-vehicle experience, I mean, I've driven plenty of other EVs aside. I mean, my wife and I, she has a Model Y, I have a Model 3. But prior to that, we had a Bolt, we had both generations of Chevy Volt, we had a Spark EV, and I've driven plenty of other vehicles. And I have to say, there is something to the minimalism approach that Tesla has used. Now, on one hand, it's great for manufacturing because it's like 75 less buttons.
For
It's
sure.
just
For
it's like
sure.
it's cheaper to
Yeah.
build a car that way. But at the same time, the to your point about how they can make changes and add features that are
Yeah.
unique, leveraging software that way is really amazing. And I think that they've really shown how they can do that in a very thoughtful way. But these other companies that, again, legacy brands especially, they have to figure out where software will live in their world as a core competency. But I hear that conversation, and then on the other side, the next day I hear, and now we have blank energy as part of our home energy
Yeah,
something. I'm going, okay, I get it. It's important to figure out how to compete, but at some point, I mean, I'm very exhausted with the press releases. Let's say that. I don't want to see on the
that's
press
putting it
release.
politely.
Yeah, I mean, it's how often can you read something, and if you're in the know, you look at it and go, no, that's fluff.
Yeah,
Like
well, and
there's no meat on that bone.
it kind of goes back to the conversation we were also having earlier about an organization around like focusing on all sorts of different things instead of staying in that kind of core area. And I am the biggest fan. I think the concept of vehicle to grid is really fascinating. I think there's a lot of potential, but I do not think they have thought that one through as far as how many questions that generates.
Oh my
And
gosh,
it gets
yeah,
a lot of people interested in the technology, but unfortunately, uh, it falls apart real quickly when they find out they have to upgrade their panel just to do it, and that's
yeah,
$6,000 plus another $10,000 to put in another gateway and all these other things they have to do.
yep.
Um, Obviously, if you got a really brand new home and the panel's wide open, yeah, it should be. Then it's only a couple $1,000s, but
But it's
it's
still
not.
thousands of
Yeah,
dollars to do
exactly,
this.
and it's
Yeah.
not like I think everyone sees like, oh, I just plug it in and it just works, and
Well,
unfortunately,
that's what the Super Bowl ad
yeah,
said a few years ago, and the reference you just made is exactly what I saw in an owners
yeah,
group. Someone had reserved a particular truck that promised that it could charge your home for or
yep,
keep your house powered on for a week or more, and they reserved the truck, and then they called their electrician, and the electrician said, "What are you doing?" And this
right,
is a guy, and he had a whole paragraph, multi-paragraph response, but it wasn't even about the money. It was about the fact that he felt duped because by the
right,
time he got done talking to his electrician, the guy walked him through it and said, "Yeah, this is going to probably end up costing you about 20,000 bucks to fully upgrade everything and get all the equipment and to do what you want." And that to me is again, it's just we have to look like we're competing. So let's say
right,
something, and then uh-oh, we didn't really know what we were talking about. But also in fairness, let's be honest, like Tesla, they weren't offering Vita X either. They
right.
they they're just like, buy more
Which,
batteries from us,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah. It's only
So,
really within the announcement of the Cybertruck within the past month that they're like, okay, now we're going to try doing this.
well, and
Um,
they signed themselves up for that with every deal they made for
right,
access to the supercharger network and
for
900
sure,
volt vehicles
for
and
sure.
yeah. But I agree with you 1,000% on the Vita X promise. And we've been asked this by many partners that we work with is, what's the role you think you can play in the programs we have related to managed charging and Vita X, et cetera. And we've got some things that we're working on for how we can slowly roll into those conversations. But I've said to many people, I think the promise of that, like you said very well, is people are not thinking about like the human element there.
Right,
What are we actually asking people to do? We're effectively saying to them, if you're a homeowner, when you plug your vehicle in, we will siphon fuel out of your car at some point that you paid
right.
for. And we have to then offer them some kind of actual value back. And right now, the programs that are pilots around this are if you sign up today, we'll give you 100 bucks. And if you keep doing this at the right time, we'll give you another 25. I think that for early adopters that want to just because they like to nerd out on the engineering and the tech, I think
Yeah.
they might dive in. Average folks are going to say, real quick, time out. If I paid,
Hell no.
yeah, if I paid X
Yeah.
amount of dollars for this fuel,
Right,
you better be giving me a pretty good premium to suck it back out of my car, and
right.
it's just invasive. And everybody that I've talked to inside of the energy sector that are a lot of them that are leading these projects, there is a need to create a better appreciation around this is not a thermostat. This is not a fridge. This is someone's
Yeah,
car. It's their mode of transportation. It's an extension of their personality. You can't just tap into that like it's a thermostat. It's a different. You are engaging with someone and something about their ownership experience that's very different than what you might be thinking. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. Is there's a lot more that needs to be discussed around this before we have all these stationary storage things waiting for us to tap into. It's like no, there are people that own cars that you're hoping they will sign up for what you're doing.
and then there's that whole thing called software that a lot of these OEMs are struggling with. That is the only way that this is all going to work.
Right. Yeah.
That, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I mean, uh, I think there's plenty of reasons you could say why Tesla actually wasn't doing it, but I always did think the argument that at least they were trying to make, or at least Elon was specifically about the idea is like, well, if you're and kind of growing up somewhere where maybe once a year, maybe twice a year if it's a bad year, we might lose power for like a couple days. And
Hmm.
so the argument was like, well, if you're out of power and it's plugged in your car and you have to go to the store,
Right
that's
there.
great for you, but the rest of your family now is out
Sits
of
in the dark.
power. Yeah, and I mean, some power is better than no power, I guess. But like, even I kind of agreed with. That. I was like, yeah, that kind of automatically. Now that you can even do that with the Cybertruck as a backup thing, I would still. I mean, now I don't have to buy like 10 or whatever Powerwalls, but it's still like if you actually are considerate about this, you still have to buy one. They're not
Yeah.
cheap,
Well,
um,
but no, that's that example you
and
just
that's a
gave
whole
is
nother thing. Yeah,
well,
but
but that's the exact example the gentleman that had reserved that I think it was a Ford F-150 Lightning, and
yeah,
that
yeah,
was the exact example he gave. He said my daughter is an asthmatic, and sometimes we've had to rush her. You know, like we've had incidences where we've had to take her to the hospital. So what happens if I have to take her to the hospital? And my electrician said, well, you unplug your truck and your house turns off. And he said, how is this a value add to my life again? I don't get it, you know?
yeah,
And so, I mean, again, my family, we have solar and home batteries. And we have seen the benefit from that even here in Oregon, where we're not
right,
exactly a solar haven, but
right,
it really works well. And we don't have to think about if I could augment what I've done with my home batteries by going further with my car, I would totally say, yeah, that's a cool added feature. I'd be down for
right,
that. But
right.
having it be like the binary of it's either this or that, I think, giving consumers some flexibility on that is going to be important in the long run because I don't think people are just going to say, I've plugged in my EV and if you want to suck power out of it, hey, have at it. I just don't see how people are going to sign up for that immediately. I just don't. So,
Yeah, and I think this is true about a lot of different things when it comes to EVs right now. But I've especially thought this about the whole V to G thing. This maybe can be the last thing we say about it. But it reminds me of kind of like Windows versus Mac in the 90s. And you obviously would see like those comparison charts, usually by some company that had a Windows computer they were selling about where it was different in a functionality and feature thing. And visually that looks good, but it's not like practical for what people are using.
right.
And I think the big part of it too is, and then actually you saw this the same with iOS versus Android, where Apple's making all the money off their computers and their hardware, and it's people aren't really buying the hardware; they're buying the functionality and the software elements.
Mhm.
So, X companies can uh, try and compete on like different function sets, and then you can say, "Hey, this ABC company has function set that 123 car company doesn't have."
Mhm.
And it's just not a really good sell. Or I mean, it might work, but it's really just strong long term, not a very strong argument. I just feel like,
Yeah.
uh, and and then there's the whole thing about the battery warranty. How many times do you charge it if you're using it from the house? I don't know.
No, so the way I finally
This
have
goes down a long rabbit hole of
well, but again to your point, the listeners that you have for your
yeah,
podcast and folks in this space, I think we all need to be very honest to ourselves about what we're talking about. And I finally have said to folks in the energy sector that we partner with that I think there are ways to walk people into the V to X opportunity. I think that if at the end of the day, what we're talking about is V to H, vehicle to home, vehicle to V to L, vehicle to load, vehicle to grid, so V to G, and even V to V, vehicle to vehicle, if you wanted to get cute with it. And it's a thing you can do. But
right.
I think that what we finally landed on for how we explain it to people in the space for how they should be thinking strategically about consumer engagement is right now no one has visibility into anything. Like that's the thing is if you want to go all the way to the step of we want to control this thing fully, it's like okay, well right now you've got nothing. People aren't
Yeah,
listening to you, they're not paying attention, they're not giving you information. At a minimum, you need visibility into where are EVs located so that at a minimum you can be doing basic homework around what are you doing to again the grid around that area, and then with that visibility you can also get a sense for how many of those vehicles are actually V2X capable. So how many assets are there out in the field? Then from there, the next step after visibility is influence. The best you can ever beg for is we'd like to influence your behavior somehow. That means either A, we would like to have you not charge at certain times to help us manage load, or when you're plugged in, we'd like to maybe stop your charge or pull some power off. But the moment you go from that, you go from influence into actual control. And the moment you're having control, that means that consumer has had to say, I'm signing up for this, that you can actually control
Right.
my destiny about how my car is filled up. That's a big step. The value proposition has to be very real. And after control is fully managed, like it's just automated. And that people just plug in and they don't have to think, you don't have to think. It's just great. And to your point, boy, that's a lot of software. Like that's a lot of the right things communicating the right way that are also built off of a value proposition that, as of our conversation, is I think is showing it's built on some pretty shaky ground. So I
And
think,
it's using infrastructure that's pretty damn old.
there's that. I'm still
Yeah.
amazed that more utilities aren't offering up after the experience we had here with our solar and batteries here in Oregon. I'm thinking if we're talking about building more power plants, I swear to God, there should just be a subsidized program for, okay, if your roof has some decent sun access, solar and some home batteries, we've been 60% off grid in the last 2 years here
Wow.
in Oregon. That's bonkers.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And it's like, why are we building more power plants? We could be offsetting so much of this load with like, hey, you have just solar and some home batteries and you're good to go. But then it turns into, well, what if we just use their car? And I'm just over there going, oh,
Yeah.
no, no,
But
no.
I think there's already been so many cool I mean, yeah, this is actually what I think is way more fascinating is virtual power plants.
Yeah.
And obviously a huge software component to that, but
Yeah.
much more impressive as to what can be done and is actually already working around, especially kind of what you're talking about, home use, and then being able, when there's either a power outage or the potential for a brownout, using software that's already available in the technology to mitigate that and to
Yeah.
kind of minimize those issues. And I completely agree with you. I think there are other people and maybe other interests that have kind of pushed back on that.
Yeah.
But as far as like a practical, and I think what most people are more likely to experience first, like the whole concept of having just solar and batteries that are subsidized by your utility, I think is much more likely to catch on and uh, be at least financially much more approachable than the current status of using your car as a big battery to back up your house.
Then it turns into who owns the asset, who's managing it, et cetera, et cetera, and I,
Right.
I just, I'm, the thing of it, it always reminds me of that quote from Jurassic Park when they're all sitting there having lunch and he's like, your scientists were so preoccupied wondering if they could, they didn't stop to think if they should, you
Yes.
know? And I've said that jokingly to some, colleagues in our industry because there's a fever pitch around some of this stuff too. The promise of something. I mean,
Yeah.
when we saw it happen with autonomy and that bubble burst, we saw it happening sort of with charging all of a sudden, a bunch of SPACs and EV SPACs that happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those kind of fizzled. Now we're having this, well, what if the energy is controlled this certain way? And I just look at all these things, I'm thinking, okay, brass tacks, what is it we need people to engage with us on, and how do we need to help them have and lead a quality life? And there's an energy aspect to that in a big way that they haven't thought about before. So it's getting them to think about it, but then also not asking too much of them. And I think that
Right.
the influence piece of, if you invite them in and say, this is you choose your own adventure. If you have a car that has a big battery on it, we'd love to have you involved in these programs because here's the value it can bring to you, and also potentially to, other aspects of, your neighborhood or God knows what. I mean, but then you start to walk that line of altruism that most people kind of go, I'm gonna tell you this, but no.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time. So
Right. Yeah, and that's and I think we've kind of touched on a lot of it. I mean, if you go to the Chargeway website,
mhm,
obviously a big portion of it is talks about utilities.
mhm.
And obviously you've kind of had that experience and exposure talking with about this. Is there anything that you can share that you've done or you're working with utilities now that is kind of what we're talking about, or has it been mostly around kind of I mean, it sounds like a large part of this anyway is education, but
Sure.
providing the education through beacons or the Chargeway app for
Mhm.
X utility, or is it
Yeah.
starting to kind of go beyond that, or is it kind of early days?
Well, I think it's still, as much as you, me, and everyone else that's probably
Yeah.
listening, we all talk about this all the time.
Right.
Again, we're a very small segment of the marketplace, and it's just the population. We have done a lot of work with utilities on helping them figure out where to position, how to explain the value of their programs.
Mm.
We hear it very often where maybe it's a level 2 program, or if you sign up for this level 2 home charging program, we will give you X rebate. And what is the hope of that program? Well, we want you to buy this charger because it's managed, so we can do some testing around how we can throttle your charge or turn it off. And so and that's the thing. It's a little bit of it's kind of bait and switchy, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we'll just do this thing for free. And in the fine print, it says we are going to potentially turn off your charger.
Right.
A friend of mine in Los Angeles was telling me a story about one of his neighbors who, like, they bought a Nest thermostat through a utility program,
Oh
not
yeah.
realizing that, oh yeah, we will shut your AC off if the grid gets too stressed. And he was flipping out over it. And they were talking about it. And he said, yeah, but that's what you signed up for. He's like, no, I thought I was just getting a rebate for a thermostat. I didn't realize they're going to make my house too hot to be sitting in. So that part of it is what we keep talking to any utility we talk to is about. Be very thoughtful around what we're actually asking of people. Right now, they don't think about electricity and energy virtually at all. We've
Yeah.
had very simple to use and frankly cheap to access energy for a century that has made our modern life what it is. But this new element of you need to understand how electricity works in your life, whether that's your home or maybe to fuel your mode of transportation, we have to be very thoughtful around, again, what is that incumbent experience they've had and what are they used to? And
For
we're
sure.
never going to get there by making them become electrical or mechanical engineers to understand the value of why we're pulling X amount of kilowatt hour off their battery. It's just not going to happen. So,
Yeah, and I mean it's not to go too deep, and it's I mean that's very spot on, especially when you start talking about EVs, because then you have so many variables. But you look at how so many different utilities and especially counties and different cities are really pushing for the electrification of home appliances versus like natural
mhm.
gas and others. And even that has such a educational barrier to understand, like, well, this is I've always used natural gas, good or bad.
Yep.
And then I think that's facing so many headwinds to then try and throw on the EV component and how all
Right.
this works. And then,
You
God
can't get them to
forbid,
switch their oven. Like, come
yeah,
on.
exactly.
Yeah. Well,
You're
and
asking them to do that and then back up your house. This is sound a
well,
little far fetched.
and there's political ramifications to it,
Right.
and the
Of
fact that
course.
electricity has become politicized is bonkers, but
Yeah.
it's where we are. And I think that that's a big thing that should be really, again, we should be paying attention to how did that happen. And
True.
with regard to, again, the conversations we have with utilities, so we have programs where we have worked to help position and promote the value of these programs with regard to how does that look inside of the Chargeway beacon? How can a sales rep at a showroom see value? And 9 times out of 10, it's, hey, if you provide, if you provide information to our customer, and this is the utility saying this,
Yeah.
we'd love to work with your dealership on how we can give you some benefits around those programs. And that's where you have to help create relationships between stakeholders that haven't really worked together before.
Right.
And but the automakers are kind of catching wind of, oh, it's a holistic process. So we'll just roll in your level 2 charging install when you buy the car. That undermines any level 2 program from utility at the showroom.
Yeah.
And so there's those challenges. But I mean, we've got a variety of different things we've touched on with utility programs. One, we have a program we're launching with Austin Energy starting in Q1, Q2 of this coming year that
Oh,
is
cool. Congrats.
solely focused on how we can give energy information to drivers in the Chargeway mobile app and how is it related to their lifestyle. Because if they are a homeowner, it's a different type of value proposition than if they're not. And
For
what are
sure.
these programs from a utility like Austin Energy, and how can we showcase the value of that to each of the users that we have based on the fact that we're already trying to create a tailored experience for them, and that's the value they get out of using Chargeway. So it's about creating a personal, authentic relationship with your customers as it relates to energy and making sure that the ecosystem you're having them live within has answers for them. Because if they have to keep jumping out to find solutions, or if they're given information that feels misleading, as we've discussed and we've seen from various stakeholders, well, then you just immediately lose trust. And
Right.
that's a big part of what we're talking about is building trust with the public around electrification. So,
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the last hour already we have, I mean, there's so many different areas that we've discussed that could easily be their own podcast episodes. And I don't know. I feel like I really enjoyed talking with you, Matt, because sometimes I feel very optimistic and then I feel reminded about everything that also bothers me. But at least I know there's someone else that knows and understands these problems.
well, I
But
appreciate that.
yeah, let's try to keep it optimistic. So
Well,
um,
that's not to say there's not great things happening in this
for
space. I mean,
sure, for
say,
sure, for sure,
the sales volumes of EVs, the joke
it's
about,
all
oh,
going in the right direction.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
happening. I think that there's reason to be pragmatic around.
Pragmatic. That's yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's just saying what's happening in this conversation and where are we seeing sales volumes going to. We're at 8% now nationally. California's at like 24% or something like that last quarter. So things are going in the direction that electrification it ain't going away.
For sure.
So
And I think just I mean those are great examples and great numbers, but what I think is so to be positive and to kind of reconfirm what we've seen these similar things happen in China. And there's obviously sometimes been different levers that different governments and stuff and even public or private companies can pull, but it seems like everything we've seen, whether it's China or Europe, a lot of these kind of happen at a logarithmic scale. And for a long time, everyone in the industry has kind of said, oh, no, it's not going to happen here. No, 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 that can, yeah, that'll be the thing that happens in Europe. But I mean, even just in the last, I'd say 2 years, let alone half year,
mhm.
the and there's been a little bit of a pullback, but I think you're just seeing that across the auto industry right now in general. It's not really that much of an EV specific thing, but you're seeing all
Yeah.
those right numbers that we've seen in other markets where it's like, no, this isn't going to happen. Maybe it's going to happen. Like, okay, crap, this is actually happening. We got to get on board whether we've wanted it to or not. And I think it is obviously a really positive thing. And so I think where we're seeing everything going is all stuff to be excited for,
Oh my
and to
gosh.
be
Yeah.
optimistic about. Because I mean, for how long I've known and kind of followed the stuff you're doing, it just seems like it. Like I said earlier, when Chargeway launched, there was maybe the Model S, the Bolt, the Leaf, and a
Well,
couple.
I mean, we initially introduced the idea. This would have been what 2017. So there was a few more
Okay,
cars on the
yeah, there's more
market.
on the yeah,
But your point, not a ton. I mean, it was like
yeah.
maybe the i3,
Right, right,
like
right,
the
right.
Fiat 500e or
There's a
something.
lot of them that have come and gone.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
uh,
Yeah,
and
compliance cars that are now in the dustbin of history.
Yeah,
That are no
collector's
longer on the
cars
market.
somewhere, I guess.
Yeah.
But for sure. But I think I also want to be respectful of your time because I realize we're kind of coming up almost on an hour here. We've talked about kind of where the app's come, where it's going, the things that we're excited about. Can you share just a few things that, if you haven't already, about since you started Chargeway, things that have kind of surprised you or you weren't expecting kind of see with uh, where you had started and where you might see either the pull from the market or just kind of the feedback from users of the app.
I think one of the things that surprised me over the last 5 years is I frankly anticipated that the third party charging networks would have a better understanding of the role that they were going to play in the ownership experience. And they would be concerned about their brands looking like they don't care about the driving and fueling experience.
Hmm.
But over time, it just became more obvious that because of the business models that exist within EV charging and how grants are issued and how revenue
Yeah.
is made and things like that, it just became so obvious that it was, in some cases, unfortunately, not about the driver. And it was far more so about the opportunity to grow the business and kind of pass the buck over
Right.
to whoever was buying your services to say, now it's your problem to make sure that the charger is okay and that drivers are satisfied. But at face value, the way that those programs were being sold, whether it was to a policymaker, a city, a municipality, or even a small business, it always was with the promise of, no, our chargers are on all the time and it's on
Yeah.
our app and you're on our network now and it's going to be so great for you. And I think that in the long term, like in the last 5 years especially, we've seen the damage it's done. We've seen the articles all the time about people saying you can't rely on these things, and it's unfortunate. And I had far more optimism around that for networks. And frankly, Ford and other brands waving the white flag saying, I do see it as that, a waving of the white flag saying, we're switching to the Tesla connector. We're just going to basically say, we'd love to tap into what you guys got because you take care of it and it works. Um, to me, that sent a very, very loud signal to third party networks of you either step this up or the valuation of your companies are just going to go,
Yeah.
and so they're going to have to do a better job. So I would say that it surprised me how that didn't improve as I thought it would. And
Interesting.
it's unfortunate. But
Yeah.
I think within that, what we tried to do within the Chargeway platform was to provide as much transparency as we could to people. So again, in the station finding element of Chargeway, again, if you click on a pin, you can see the details of it. We always had customer support information that you could contact for the network. And we always tried to tell you it's this network that's backing that station. If it was white
Yeah.
label and had branding from gosh, who knows what all over it, we would still say, if you got a problem, this is who you call. And if you want to leave a review, you can. But if you want to report a problem, you hit one button in the Chargeway app on a station. It auto populates the station information into the body of the email. It sends it directly to the customer support team from that network. All you got to do is add your notes and hit send. So these are ways that we've always been trying to help drivers have a voice in this space. And obviously there's other ways they can go about doing it on social media and others, but that's something that I think has definitely made an impact on
Hmm.
kind of adding a level of honesty from some players that needed to improve upon things. But yeah, we'll see how that plays out. But I think we've always looked at it and said, if we can showcase where you can go and what your expectation and experience of what your experience will be, then it's on the inside of the companies to live up to that on behalf of the driver. And I think we're going to see that some of those both auto brands and networks are going to survive better than others. And I don't know. I mean, again, there's a lot of EVs on the market now. I mean, you rewind 5 years and we've quintupled how many are on the market. I'd be willing to bet, and we've also quintupled the
At
amount of
least.
networks out there.
Unfortunately and fortunately, yes, that is true that those have also increased. Going to your point about reliability around those, I think, what is fascinating with going back to the conversation we had earlier about the expectation of brands and what like, oh, I've always bought brand X, so I'm just going to buy brand X's EV.
Yep.
And there might still be some areas where they excel in, but it's very clear that you're getting new or traditional car, not only just new startups and new players in the space, but especially uh, brands that have kind of been, I think, traditionally viewed as maybe like a lower tier brand, but they've seen electrification as kind of their opportunity to really change that and get a hold of that. And of
Oh yeah.
course, probably the biggest one people think of are the Kia and Hyundai, where they
Yep.
were kind of lower cost competitive vehicles that were kind of didn't offer a lot around traditional amenities. And they were already kind of in the process of changing that expectation or impression, and then really just latched onto electrification and have now kind of leapfrogged a lot of others in the space. So I think
Oh yeah.
it's still very early days between not just the automakers and the startups and then the charging infrastructure, but there's still so much that, I mean, it's crazy how much has changed the last time since the last time we had you on the podcast. So I can't wait, and hopefully it'll be sooner than the
Yeah.
last kind of time that we get to talk with you soon about some of these changes and what we're seeing in the space. But one kind of final question I like to ask people, I think we've also touched on a little bit, but just to kind of get it out there, one question we ask everyone is, in your experience, kind of in your uh, to you, what needs to either be done by government or maybe private? What could be done really between any of these that would have the biggest impact, you think, in moving EV adoption and charging infrastructure forward?
That's a big question. I will say I still, and I'm on the broken record on it, but now that we're hearing the conversation from dealerships saying, we've got all these cars stacking up on our showroom lots and we're not happy about it and people aren't wanting these things. The moment I saw that 4,000 auto dealers had written a letter to the Biden administration saying we need you to pause on your EV mandates and they are very adamant about this, I immediately just asked the question that I asked, years ago when we launched Chargeway, which is why would anybody go to a dealership to buy a car that runs on electricity as a fuel if they don't know anything about electricity as a fuel? Why would they do that?
Right.
They don't know what they don't know. And we've seen countless campaigns around EVs are here and let's get more butts and seats. And oh gosh, there's Super Bowl ads that you couldn't miss an EV ad a few years ago, right? And that's
Yeah.
all it was. And I just kept watching that thinking, yep. And if you go out and go to any bar or any restaurant tonight in any town you're in America and say, if every gas station closed tomorrow, how would you use your car? Because everyone would say, I couldn't.
Right.
But if we were doing it the right way with messaging, so if we're talking about from the federal government or wherever, if we were doing it right with messaging, the right response from the public, because if they had the right exposure to the information correctly, they'd say, well, it wouldn't really matter. I guess I could just drive an electric car. Because right now people equate cars to gasoline. And the
Yeah.
reason why we have brands, and again, this is Ford and other brands that have said we've got some vehicles that are starting to stack up here. They have an uphill battle because the type of customer that they've cultivated for the last 20 years is not your ideal EV buyer. And
Right.
that's a part of the game. And they are trying to pivot, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. I think combine that with the fact that you have a lack of understanding around what they can trust and what they even know about. There's walk down the street. Everybody listen to this podcast. I invite you to this next time, your holiday party, whatever, whenever you hear this, ask everybody in the room that is not related to the EV industry. Have you heard of electric fuel for your car? Do you know about it? Or just say, if every gas station closed tomorrow, how would you drive your car? And chances are they'd all say the same thing, which is, I guess I couldn't drive a car. And that right there speaks to the problem of we have zero visibility to the public around that they have a fuel choice. And I think my hair is going to get grayer over time because I keep beating this drum. And I don't know why it's not more obvious to everybody. I mean, you can make the right ecosystem like Tesla has, but man, you got to control it all.
Yeah.
And they've done it really well. And we just don't have that luxury to offer to the public from every product line. So that would be my hope, is we can get more honest to ourselves around the fact that buying a car has always meant two products, cars and gas. And we've removed gas. And so we have to talk about electricity as a trusted fuel source and not get over our skis and start asking Vita X questions about, hey, can we tap into your car and borrow some kilowatt hours? Because people are very far away from having that conversation.
I think that is a great place to end it on for a couple reasons. One, clearly the battery in my camera has died. But two, I think that is such a great summary of what the challenges that the industry is facing. And I think, once again, what you and Chargeway have done such a good job of hoping to like get people at least aligned around to ask the right question and then provide a really clear and concise answer to. So I just want to say thank you again so much for being back on, Matt, and looking forward to talking again with you soon.
Definitely. Well, again, thanks for the invite and always enjoy chatting with you.